plane crashes in the heart of the Amazon jungle, leaving survivors stranded in a hostile wilderness. As they fight for survival, they realize they're being hunted by something ancient, intelligent, and terrifying. Strange symbols appear, whispers fill the air, and the jungle's dark secrets begin to surface. Escape is impossible, unless they can uncover the horrifying truth lurking in its depths. May 13, 1976, was supposed to be just another routine flight. The sun shone brightly as Flight 141 ascended into the cloudless sky, leaving the bustling airport behind. A crew of seasoned pilots and 20 unsuspecting passengers were aboard, many unaware of the darkness that would soon unfold. Among them, a trauma-surviving medic, an investigative journalist chasing whispers of ancient legends, a family of 5 seeking a fresh start, their lives intertwined by fate. They had no idea that this would be the last flight they would ever take, at least, not as they thought. The plane sliced through the clouds, heading towards its destination, but something was wrong. Unseen forces stirred beneath the earth, deep within the Amazon. The jungle was not just an ordinary wilderness, it had its own secrets, secrets that no one dared to speak of. As turbulence rattled the aircraft, the engine screamed in protest, and the unthinkable happened. With a violent jolt, the plane plummeted from the sky. The crash was deafening, the world going dark in an instant. What awaited them was far more terrifying than any storm. Stranded in a remote, uncharted jungle, survival became their first challenge. But the jungle had other plans. The wreckage was scattered across the dense, unforgiving terrain of the jungle. The few survivors of the crash woke up in the eerie silence, their bodies bruised and broken, their minds scrambling to comprehend what had just happened. Among them were the pilots, who barely made it out alive but managed to drag themselves from the wreckage. The medic, still in shock from the loss of several passengers, quickly assessed the situation, his military training kicking in. He knew they had to move, to gather what little they could, and find shelter before the jungle's nightmarish creatures emerged. But the crash wasn't just a disaster. It was a beginning. The jungle stretched endlessly around them, dark and impenetrable, the thick canopy blocking out the sun, giving everything a sense of suffocating confinement. The air was humid and heavy, and the sounds of the jungle, strange rustling, distant roars, and the eerie calls of unseen creatures, kept the survivors on edge. Each step they took seemed to lead them further into the unknown, and with each passing day, the jungle began to feel less like a place of nature and more like something sinister, alive with unseen eyes. As they wandered deeper into the jungle, they stumbled across signs of ancient ruins, forgotten civilizations, and strange symbols carved into the trees. Some of the symbols seemed familiar to the journalist, who had spent years researching lost legends and tribal myths. But the more she studied them, the more they unsettled her. These weren't just markings, they were warnings. The jungle was ancient, and its secrets were buried deep. Days turned into weeks, and the survivors' hopes of rescue began to fade. With limited food and fresh water, tensions among them grew. Some argued over the best course of action, while others simply tried to keep going, hoping against hope that someone would find them. But the jungle was vast, and the rescue they desperately craved seemed increasingly impossible. Yet they were not alone. At night, the whispering voices began, faint and incomprehensible, seeming to come from all directions. Every rustle of leaves made them jump. Every snapping twig brought their hearts to their throats. Were they being watched by predators, or something far worse? The group's unity began to fracture, as trust became a rare commodity. One by one, the survivors started noticing strange things. Footprints that appeared overnight and led nowhere, shadows that moved when no one was near, and the constant sensation of being hunted. But who or what was doing the hunting, and why? Survival had turned into a desperate struggle for not only food and water, but for their very sanity. The jungle had a presence, an intelligence, one that began to toy with them, twisting the world around them. And as they moved forward, they started to realize something far more horrifying. They were not just lost. They were being tested. It had been almost a month since the crash. The survivors were on the brink of collapse, their bodies weak and their minds unraveling from the constant tension and fear. Every moment was a battle against the jungle's oppressive heat, the never-ending hunger, the thirst that seemed unquenchable, and the creeping dread that they were not alone. One morning, the group set out again, searching for a way out, desperate for any sign of civilization or hope. The jungle stretched in every direction, an endless sea of green that felt both suffocating and alive. They had begun to mark trees, using the strange symbols from the ruins as their guide, believing there was some sort of logic to the path they were taking, some kind of secret message hidden in the patterns. But as they ventured further, they encountered something that stopped them cold, an altar. The discovery was both terrifying and awe-inspiring. Hidden deep within the jungle's heart, shrouded in vines and centuries of neglect, the altar was unlike anything they had seen before. It was made of dark stone, its surface worn and covered in strange carvings, each one more intricate than the last. The air around it seemed thick, heavy with a presence they couldn't explain. The ground beneath their feet felt unnatural, as if the very soil itself was rejecting them. The medic, despite his best efforts to remain calm and rational, couldn't shake the sense of unease that washed over him. His military training had taught him to read the signs of danger, to trust his instincts. But there was something otherworldly about the place, something ancient and alive. The survivors gathered around the altar, their hearts pounding in their chests as they tried to make sense of it. The symbols they had been following seemed to converge here, the final puzzle piece in a mystery that was quickly becoming too vast to comprehend. It was then that the first sign of the unseen force made itself known. From the altar, something moved, a shadow, a flicker of movement in the corner of their eyes. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't the wind. No, this was something else, something far more sinister. The ground trembled beneath them, and the air grew even heavier, as if something was watching them, something ancient, something waiting. The whispers began again, louder now, swirling around them like a storm. But these weren't just random noises. The whispers were clear, as if they were speaking directly to the survivors, urging them, beckoning them toward the altar. A sense of panic began to rise within the group as they looked at one another, their expressions a mixture of fear and confusion. Then, without warning, the ground gave way. A massive section of the jungle floor collapsed beneath their feet, sending several survivors tumbling into a dark, hidden pit below. The medic, the journalist, and a few others were thrown into the darkness, landing on a hard, unforgiving surface. The world above them grew distant as they struggled to stand, the air now thick with an ominous presence. The pit was deep, and as they looked around, they realized that they were no longer in the jungle. The walls around them were lined with strange symbols, just like the ones on the trees, the altar, the ruins. But these were different. These were not just carvings, they were alive, pulsing with a faint, eerie glow. It was then they realized the terrible truth. They hadn't just stumbled upon an ancient civilization. They had walked into its trap. The jungle wasn't just a place. It was a living entity, a prison that had held countless victims before them. And now, they were part of its twisted game. The survivors were no longer just lost. They were part of something far darker, something that had been waiting for them. The survivors, now trapped in the pit, struggled to regain their composure. The air around them was suffocating, thick with an unnatural humidity that clung to their skin like a second layer. They scanned their surroundings, searching for an escape, but all they saw were the glowing, pulsating symbols that seemed to warp the very space around them. The pit was deep, its walls slick with an almost oily substance. There was no clear way out, no sign of any passage that led to the surface. It was as if they had been pulled into the belly of the jungle itself, swallowed by the earth. Desperation gnawed at them as they tried to climb the walls of the pit, but the surface was too smooth, the walls too high. They were trapped, with no clear direction or hope of salvation. The sounds of the jungle above them, once a constant presence, had disappeared, replaced by a haunting stillness that seemed to press down on them from all sides. It was as if the jungle had swallowed them whole, as though they no longer belonged to the world they had known. As time dragged on, The survivors began to feel the weight of isolation in ways they hadn't anticipated. The silence in the pit was deafening, a heavy cloak that smothered their thoughts and left them with only their fears for company. There was no escape, no help. The hours turned into days, and their bodies began to weaken from hunger, dehydration, and the lack of sleep. But there was something else, something far worse creeping into their minds. The jungle wasn't just a physical place. It had become a presence, something that moved with them in the dark, pressing down on their sanity. Every rustle in the shadows, every flicker of movement, felt like a hand brushing against their minds, probing, testing. One survivor, the journalist, began to suffer from hallucinations. She would see faces, pale, gaunt faces, staring at her from the dark corners of the pit, their eyes wide and empty. The faces were familiar and strange at the same time, their features constantly shifting, melting, and reforming. At first, she tried to dismiss them, attributing them to exhaustion, but as the days passed, the faces grew clearer. They were the faces of the dead, faces of those who had been trapped here before her, who had never escaped, their souls now bound to the jungle. The more she tried to look away, the more they seemed to draw closer, pressing in on her, their hollow eyes pleading for release. The medic, too, began to unravel. His military training had kept him focused in the face of battle, but here, in this pit, he found no enemy to fight, no war to win. Instead, he faced a different kind of battle, one for his mind. The jungle's presence pressed against him like a vice, each breath a struggle against the suffocating air. He began to lose track of time, his thoughts clouding over with paranoia. Was it the jungle driving him mad, or was something else at work here? Then the nightmares began. They were unlike any dreams the survivors had ever experienced. These were not just dreams, they were visions, vivid and horrifying. In the dead of night, they would be consumed by a sensation of falling, their bodies plummeting into a vast, endless void. The ground would shift beneath them, and they would hear whispers, distant and alien, calling to them from the darkness. No matter how much they tried to wake up, the feeling would not dissipate. The nightmares would linger long after they opened their eyes, leaving them shivering with dread. But there was something worse. In the waking hours, they began to see strange markings on their skin. At first, they thought it was the result of insect bites or scratches from the jagged rocks and foliage. But as the days passed, the markings became more distinct, more deliberate. Symbols, similar to those they had seen carved into the jungle's trees and ruins, appeared on their arms, their legs, their faces. These marks didn't fade. They seemed to burn into their skin, an unnatural heat radiating from them. The survivors realized, with growing horror, that they weren't just being watched. They were being marked, chosen, and tested. The jungle was alive, but it wasn't simply an ecosystem. It was a sentient, ancient force that fed on fear, on suffering, on the breaking of the human spirit. The markings on their skin were proof of this. They were being prepared for something far worse than they could imagine. As their minds began to fray, as the jungle closed in around them, they found themselves drawn to the ruins they had discovered earlier. Something compelled them to go back, to see the altar again. The symbols on their skin seemed to glow with an unnatural energy as they approached the stone structure. The air felt thick, almost electric, as if the altar were alive, waiting for them. When they reached the altar, they understood. The jungle was not just their prison. It was a test, a trial they had been unknowingly chosen for. The altar, with its ancient carvings, was the key to understanding the jungle's terrible secret. And as the survivors gathered around it, the jungle stirred, and the true horror of their situation began to reveal itself. They were not just trapped in the jungle, they were part of its ancient, twisted ritual. To survive, they would have to face something far worse than their physical wounds, the very essence of the jungle's dark, malevolent force. The survivors stood around the altar, their bodies trembling and their minds fraying. The symbols on their skin burned with a heat that seemed to pulse in time with the jungle's unnatural hum. The air around them was thick and oppressive, almost as if the very atmosphere was alive and watching, waiting for something. It was a presence that gnawed at the edges of their minds, pulling them toward the altar, urging them to understand the terrible truth they had been circling for weeks. At first, they didn't fully comprehend what was happening, what had been happening all along. But the pieces began to fall into place. The markings, the symbols, the strange occurrences in the jungle, the hallucinations, and the growing paranoia. It was all part of the jungle's twisted design. The altar was not just a relic of a lost civilization. It was the key to the jungle's power, an anchor to something ancient and unknowable. And they were its chosen sacrifices. The ground beneath their feet trembled once more. The pit they had fallen into, the jungle itself, seemed to pulse with life, as though it were waking from a long, deep slumber. The survivors could feel it, deep in their bones, the weight of the jungle's presence, the suffocating pressure that closed in around them. The ancient force, the entity that controlled this vast, uncharted land, had been waiting for them. The jungle wasn't a simple ecosystem. It was a living, breathing thing, with intelligence and malevolence beyond anything they could fathom. It had been watching them from the moment they crashed, studying them, toying with them, and now it was time for the final stage of its ritual. Suddenly, the ground split open, sending the survivors stumbling backwards. A deep, echoing sound reverberated from the heart of the jungle, like a roar from the depths of the earth itself. The sky above them darkened, and the once dominant jungle sounds ceased. Silence fell, but it was the kind of silence that was worse than any noise, a dead, suffocating quiet. From the crack in the earth, something emerged, a figure, dark and massive, towering above them. It was not a human form, nor was it an animal. It was something far older, far more ancient. Its body seemed to shimmer, as though it were made of smoke and shadows, constantly shifting and contorting into forms too unsettling to comprehend. Its eyes, if they could even be called eyes, were hollow voids, infinite and empty, yet filled with a dark, consuming intelligence. It moved with an unnatural grace, its presence bending the very air around it. Every step it took seemed to make the ground tremble, the earth itself reverberating with a deep, primal energy. The survivors were frozen in place, their bodies paralyzed by fear. It was a force they could not hope to fight, a being whose power transcended anything they had ever known. It was the jungle, the heart of the jungle, the entity that controlled everything. They had been brought here for one purpose, to serve as its offering, its test subjects. They were not just victims of a crash, they were the latest in a long line of sacrifices, chosen to fulfill a ritual as old as the jungle itself. In that moment, everything became clear. The altar wasn't just an ancient site, it was a conduit, a focal point through which the jungle's power flowed. The survivors had been chosen not by chance, but by design. The jungle had watched them, studied them, and now it was ready to claim them as its own. But there was something more, something deeper than just the primal hunger of a beast. The jungle's true nature was far more horrifying. It was a test, a trial, a means of determining which humans would survive and which would become part of the jungle's ever-growing web of darkness. The survivors, broken and desperate, tried to escape, but it was futile. The jungle closed in around them, thick and suffocating, its branches reaching out like claws. Every path they tried to take led them back to the altar, to the heart of the jungle's power. They could feel it closing in, surrounding them, its intelligence probing their minds, forcing them to face their darkest fears. The jungle was not just a place, it was a living entity, a force that fed on suffering, on fear, on the breaking of the human spirit. It had learned from every sacrifice before them, and now, it was preparing for the next stage of its ritual. One by one, the survivors fell, their bodies succumbing to the jungle's relentless power. Some were claimed by the shadows, their screams lost in the silence. Others were dragged into the depths of the earth, their bodies becoming part of the jungle's twisted tapestry. The jungle absorbed them all, victims, test subjects, and survivors alike. In the end, only one remained, the medic. His body was broken, his mind shattered, but his survival instincts had kept him alive longer than anyone else. As he lay on the ground, his breathing labored, he realized the truth. The jungle had never intended for any of them to escape. It was always a game, a test, a cycle that had been repeating itself for centuries. And then, as the medic's eyes closed for the final time, the jungle fell silent once more. Its power remained, its test complete. The altar, now soaked in the blood of its victims, pulsed one last time, and the cycle began again. The jungle stood still, its dark secrets buried deep beneath the thick canopy that had never allowed the light to touch the forest floor. The survivors' cries had long since faded into the eerie silence, their names becoming whispers carried by the wind that rustled the leaves. The altar, now scarred and bloodstained, was all that remained of their presence, just another marker in the endless history of those who had been chosen by the jungle. Days passed, perhaps weeks, but time in this forsaken place no longer held meaning. The jungle, with its immense, suffocating presence, carried on as if nothing had changed, as if the rituals of sacrifice were just another part of its eternal cycle. The earth swallowed those who had dared to trespass into its domain, leaving no trace behind. The pit where the survivors had fallen was now just another forgotten hole in the ground, a mark on the land that time would eventually erase. But the jungle never truly forgets. The cycle had been completed, the test concluded. Yet, in the shadows, something stirred. The altar, now still, seemed to pulse once more, as though the jungle were breathing, preparing itself for the next. The bloodshed, the suffering, the terror that had gripped the survivors, it was merely part of the grand design. And now, with the survivors gone, the jungle would wait for its next victims, those who would unknowingly be drawn to its depths. The jungle's ancient hunger could not be sated. The altar would call again, as it always did. And in the distant future, when a new flight takes off, when a new group of souls dares to venture too close, the jungle would be ready. Its test, its ritual would continue, forever bound to the land, as eternal as the jungle itself. No one would ever escape. Not from the jungle, not from its unrelenting grasp. The jungle had claimed another set of lives, weaving them into the dark fabric of its ancient rituals. But the true horror lay in the realization that it never needed to end. The survivors' bodies had been taken, their souls absorbed into the vast, suffocating abyss of the jungle. The altar, once bathed in the blood of those who had tried to survive, now stood silent, awaiting the next arrival. The cycle, terrifying and relentless, was far from over. As the jungle settled into its unnatural stillness, there remained the faintest trace of the victims, residue from their desperate struggle, echoes of their torment lingering in the air like a faint, ghostly whisper. But with time, even those echoes would fade. The jungle was too old, too vast to allow such memories to endure for long. In its hunger for control and its insatiable need to test the breaking points of the human spirit, it erases all signs of the past, leaving only the hollow promise of its return. The survivors' fate was now a forgotten story, just one among countless others who had met their end in the dark corners of this cursed land. They had been part of a ritual as old as time, a cycle repeated over and over, never to be interrupted, never to be broken. The jungle could afford to wait. Its hunger would not be sated for long. Eventually, someone else would arrive, drawn by the promise of adventure, of discovery, or perhaps by the need to escape. And when they did, they would unknowingly find themselves caught in the jungle's grip. The cycle would begin anew, and the altar would once again demand its due. The jungle would continue to grow, to change, to adapt, but its nature would never shift. It was a force beyond comprehension, beyond reason, a malevolent intelligence that thrived on fear and suffering, a place where escape was not an option, where the question of survival had long since lost meaning. The survivors had been lost, but they were not the first, nor would they be the last. As the jungle continued its quiet, unyielding reign, another group of unsuspecting travelers prepared to embark on their journey, unaware of the darkness that awaited them. The cycle was about to begin again, just as it always did. However, this time, there was a shift in the air, something unseen, but palpable, as if the very essence of the jungle was aware of its repeating nature. The twist in the story, the horrific realization that would unfold, began long before the new passengers boarded their plane. One of the pilots, whose family had always flown this route, held a secret buried deep within him. For years, he had been haunted by the jungles, by the ancient power that lay hidden beneath the surface of the earth, and by the chilling thought that he might be more tied to it than he realized. Unbeknownst to anyone, the man was no mere servant of the airline. He was a part of the jungle's endless cycle. He had been there before. In fact, he had been there every time. The survivors from countless crashes before him, the medic, the journalist, the family, the others, had all been brought to the jungle under his watch. Each time, he would bring them to the depths of its dark heart, leave them there to be tested, then returned to his life, only to repeat the process. The man was not just a pilot. He was a keeper of the jungle's secrets, bound to it by an unspoken pact made long ago, a pact he could not escape. The survivors had not been chosen by fate alone. They had been brought there by him. Each crash, each struggle for survival, was a part of his role in the jungle's ancient game. He was the one who delivered them to the altar. He was the one who made sure the cycle continued. As the new flight prepared to take off, the pilot stood at the front, his gaze distant, almost lost. He looked up at the plane as it took to the sky, unaware that, once again, the jungle would claim what was rightfully its own. And this time, it would test them all in a new way. No one would escape the jungle, not even him. As the new plane soared high above the dense canopy of the jungle, its passengers unaware of the fate that awaited them below, the jungle pulsed once more with its ancient energy. The cycle had begun again. The jungle, vast and hungry, stretched out beneath them, its heart beating steadily as it prepared to draw in the next group of souls. The pilot, once again at the helm, was bound by a dark pact, a prisoner to the very land that had consumed so much before. He could not remember the last time he had felt free, his soul tied to the jungle, a cog in its endless, horrifying ritual. Each flight was a new beginning, but also a never-ending continuation of something far older, something far darker than he could ever comprehend. And as the plane flew onward, toward the jungle's uncharted depths, one truth remained: the jungle never forgets. It waits, watches, and tests. The altar would call again, and more lives would be drawn into its twisted embrace. For in the jungle, survival was an illusion, its power eternal. The passengers on this flight would never know what had come before them. But the jungle always knows, and it always remembers.